that we use that goes out of scope is going to be disposed of by the framework, but we're really just making it more explicit here. So we're going to have inside this interface, we're going to return an iGeneric repository of type T entity, and we'll call it repository of type T entity, and we're going to specify where T entity is of type base entity. And we're also going to return a task, that's a Boolean, and we're going to call this complete. As the idea of unit of work is our changes that we make to our database are all held inside a single transaction, and then we complete the transaction and either everything saves to the database or nothing saves to the database and everything gets rolled back. So we have a single complete method inside here. And let's go and create the implementation class for this. So inside the infrastructure folder, inside the data folder, we'll create a new file, and it's going to be a class, and we'll call it unit of work. And press return. And inside here, let's update the namespace, and we're going to implement the I unit of work, and we'll implement the interface. So inside this class, we're going to need access to our store context, so we'll inject this into there, and we'll call it context, and let's just implement these methods. So the first one, pretty straightforward, it's going to be our complete method. So we're returning a Boolean from this, and we're going to return await and context. And save changes async, that's greater than 0, so that we return a Boolean from this method. Nothing different there, we've used this before. For our dispose method, we are going to just say context.dispose. And that just guarantees that our context will be disposed of. Like I say, I'm perfectly happy to accept that that's probably completely unnecessary, but we are being explicit in what we're doing there. Now the last method, where we implement the repositories, then our unit of work is effectively going to need to have access to each different repository we have, and we've got a single generic repository, but if we had 100 entities, then technically we'd have 100 repositories based on the way that we've configured this system. So our unit of work needs access to all of those. And how we implement this? Well, first of all, we're going to create a type, var type equals, and we're going to say type of T entity dot name, and that just gives us the name of the entity we're using for a particular repository. Then we're going to return, and we're going to return an iGeneric repository of type T entity, and we're going to use inside here to do this, we're going to store our repositories in a concurrent dictionary. So let's add a property for that inside our unit of work, and we'll make it private, and we'll make it read-only, and we'll use a concurrent dictionary. And this is going to be a type of string for the key and object for effectively the repository. And we'll call it underscore repositories. And we'll give it an initial value of new to create a new instance of this concurrent dictionary that's going to have no repositories inside it when it's initialized. So then let's go back down to our method for the repository, and we'll say underscore repositories, and we'll say get or add, and we're going to pass in a type, or the type, so that's the name of the entity, and then we'll say T and add an arrow, and below this we'll create curly brackets for the code block. So first of all, we need to know what the repository type is. So we're going to say if our repository type equals type of, and then the implementation of generic repository, not the interface at this point, and just use empty angle brackets, and then we can specify make generic type, and we're going to make a type of T entity, and then we can return activator, and we're going to say create instance of the repository type, comma, and then we're going to pass in the context as the second parameter that our repository needs. And because this could be null, we're going to throw an exception if we don't have it. So we'll use the null coalescing. and say throw new invalid operation exception, and we'll use a template string for this, so I'll add a dollar and then quotes and just say could not create repository instance for, and then in curly brackets we'll say T and close that with a semicolon. And I'll just move this down inside the brackets as well. And then we can close this with a semicolon. So when we use this from our unit of work, we effectively specified the type of repository that we want. So let's say it's product, for instance. We'll say a unit of work repository and give it the type. And then we get the type name based on the entity type that we're specifying inside here. And then we're returning an instance of the iGeneric repository. But if we've already got that in our concurrent dictionary, then we're going to get it based on its type. Or if not, we're going to add it to our dictionary using this code here. So we find out what the repository type is using this method, the make generic type, and then from here we can use this activator, which contains methods to create types of objects locally or remotely. And then we use the create instance method to create an instance of the specified type using the constructor that best matches the specified parameters. So when we create a new instance of our repository, we pass it the context as well. And if we don't, or if we're not able to do that, then we're going to throw an exception. So now we have our repository or our unit of work implementation. We also need to add this as a service. So we'll go to our program class and we'll do this just underneath our generic repository. It doesn't have to be here, but I feel they're quite closely related, so I'm just going to add it underneath this one. So I'm going to say builder.services add scoped. It needs to be the same scope as our repositories, and we'll add the interface and the implementation class for the unit of work. and delete a product. So we will create a product, but it's not going to fit in with the rest of our products, so we will use the delete product at the end of this test to remove it from our database. So let's go and add a product, make sure that functionality works. And we've got a hat, and it's got an ID of 19. And that worked just fine. If I get the products and send, then we get a count of 19 and we get our products. If I get an individual product, let's just use the one that I've just created, the one with ID of 19, and click send. Then we get our created products. If I get an individual product, let's just use the one of 19 and we get our got a hat, and it's got an ID of of 19. Add a product, make sure that functionality works. And we've got a hat, and it's got an ID of of 19, and that worked just fine. If I get the products and send, then we get a count of 19 and we get our products. If I get an individual product, let's just use the one that I've just created, the one with ID of 19, and click send. Then we get our created product. If we update that product, and again, I'm just going to update the ID to 19 in this one, and also inside the body of this to 19, and we're going to be updating it and we'll know it's been updated because we've got that updated text. I'll send that. We get the 204 no content, but if we go back and get the product, we should find that it's been updated. To something else. And then finally, let's go ahead. We should find that it's been updated. 204 no content, but if we go back and get the product, we should find that it's been updated. We get the 204 no content, but if we go back and get the product, we should find that it's been updated to something else. And then finally, let's go ahead. And delete the thing that we've just created because we do not want it in our database. I'll delete the product with the ID of 19. I'll click send. We get the 204 no content. If I just go and get all of the products again, we should be back down to 18 products. Perfect. So our unit of work functionality is working. And now we have that in place, the next thing we'll look at is using this inside an order controller that we'll create next. We update that product at the end of and delete a product. In fact, let's go back to set and delete with the rest of our products. So we will use the delete product to make sure that functionality works. And we've got a hat and it's got an ID of 19 and that worked just fine. And we get our products. If I get an individual product, let's just use the one of 19 and we get